Spokane Catholic Diocese is emerging from its sex abuse crisis.
In the past 4 years, more than 180 people have come forward claiming they were sexually abused by priests in this area over the past 60 years. 66, more than 1/3, reported they were molested by former priest Patrick O'Donnell.
Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
In a series of videotaped depositions, Patrick O'Donnell admits he preyed on young boys while serving as a priest in the Spokane Catholic Diocese.
Did you molest the two brothers in the same outing? Yes. When did you molest the other boy?
I believe it was in the summer of 1974.
O'Donnell confesses there were so many boys, he has trouble remembering them all. When there were complaints, the diocese moved O'Donnell to a new parish. No one ever called police, and O'Donnell was free to molest again.
Districts across the country asking any former students of a Catholic priest accused of sexual abuse to come forward. 78-year-old brother Raymond Rose worked at several schools in Wisconsin, Minnesota, North Dakota, and California. An attorney for one former Minnesota student who is accusing Rose of rape says there are at least a dozen other victims.
The Archbishop of Freiburg has been accused of aiding and abetting sexual abuse. Apparently, Robert Zolich, who is also head of the German Bishops' Conference, permitted a priest accused of child abuse to be reappointed to a parish church in 1987.
There are startling new allegations tonight involving Raymond Lahi. He's the former Roman Catholic bishop who was charged in Ottawa with importing and possessing child pornography. Now there's word that church officials knew of allegations against him dating back to the late 1980s. That's when Lahi was a priest in Newfoundland.
We asked the Vatican's diplomatic mission if they were involved in Lahi's case in any way. They said no comment and hung up on us. Graham Richardson, CTV News, Ottawa.
According to transcripts of police wiretaps obtained by CNN, a member of the Vatican choir is allegedly involved in setting up male prostitutes for an honorary Vatican usher, a member of what's known as a Gentleman of His Holiness. Now, the Vatican has confirmed that 39-year-old Thomas Ehiem has been dismissed from the Vatican choir. That after reports emerged this week that he'd been setting up male prostitutes for Angelo Balducci. Now, Balducci is already behind bars. He was arrested last month on corruption charges related to his position as a member of the board of the Public Works Department. And apparently police, as they were investigating those charges, heard conversations through the wiretap between these two men, conversations in which Ehiem described in specific physical detail several men to Balducci. For example, he described two Cuban men that he said were tall, black, and beautiful. He also described a male model, a rugby player, and in one instance, a man who was studying for the priesthood. Now, reaction here has ranged from those who are shocked by this, as one might imagine, to some people who say they're just too jaded to be surprised anymore.
Here's a bust you probably didn't expect. A gay prostitution ring at the Vatican. Police were apparently doing an investigation using wiretaps looking for corruption in contracts for the Vatican Public Works. Instead, they have arrested 4 people in a prostitution sting. One of them is part of the elite choir that sings for the Pope at St. Peter's Basilica. Another suspect is part of Pope Benedict's ceremonial ushers. This is the same group that acted as pallbearers for Pope John Paul.
A room full of pain, 50+ people, all abused by 2 different priests as children. Father Victor Stewart of St. Charles Luanga on the south side.
We were subject to sexual abuse almost on a daily basis for many years.
The second priest, Father Terence Fitzmaurice of St. Procopius in Pilsen.
From 1979 to 1983, David was sexually molested by the school principal, Monsignor Michael Harris.
When Father Riedel came here in 1999, I asked why he'd been sent here.
Those in charge talked in vague terms about the priest being unreliable, albeit in financial matters.
I only discovered something else was going on last Monday morning, and from journalists, not from the church.
The something else involved allegations that Father Riedel, seen here on the left, systematically molested young pupils for years.
It's here, at Berlin's Canisius College, an elite Jesuit school, where the first allegations of sexual abuse were made public. This is one of the men who broke the scandal. Thomas was only 13 years old when he was subjected to sexual abuse. It took him 30 years to muster the courage to talk about it and to accuse two of his former teachers, both priests. After Thomas, hundreds of other victims spoke up.
The real scandal, which I only discovered later, is that one of the offenders was allowed to continue to abuse again and again for another 30 years in a dozen towns and schools, and even across the other side of the world in South America. He could continue offending without any of the other brothers or any of his superiors higher up in the Catholic Church putting a stop to it.
Over the last few weeks, not a day has passed without fresh allegations against more Catholic schools. The scandal quickly spread to Hamburg, Bonn and Munich. There are now allegations of abuse in 20 of the 27 dioceses in Germany, and the victims number in their hundreds. The Justice Minister here accused the Vatican of obstructing investigations into the alleged abuse in the schools. She believes the Vatican built up a wall of silence, citing a directive from 2001 which says the most severe abuse cases should be subject to papal secrecy. That missive was written by Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, the former prefect of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith.
Palm Sunday Mass at the Holy Cross Cathedral in Boston. It's normally a refuge for Catholics. It's now a firestorm amid the largest sex scandal in church history.
Tonight, more troubling revelations surface in the growing church sex abuse scandal.
A disproportionate number of gay men.
In modern times, sex scandals involving priests and children.
Every day there are more headlines about the Catholic hierarchies dealing with the pedophilia and sexual abuse crisis in Boston and around the country. The frenzy began when Father John Gagan was sentenced to 10 years on sexual abuse charges. He was accused of molesting more than 130 children over 30 years.
Guilty offenses charged with indecent assault and battery on a child under 14 years of age.
Gagan's superiors, including Bernard Cardinal Law, apparently knew about Gagan's sexual abuse, but decided to transfer him to other parishes rather than turning him over to authorities. It turned out to be just the tip of the iceberg. Since Gagan's sentencing, hundreds of other victims have stepped forward with allegations concerning priests around the country from the age of 9 to 16. Serrano says he was conditioned by the priest for about a year before the abuse began.
You know, to me, he was the church. I mean, he was a link to God as I was raised. He introduced...
Phil Saviano is another victim who now heads a regional victim survivor network. According to Saviano, Father David Holly, who is now serving more than a 200-year sentence for molesting children, began molesting Saviano and his friends in 1964. Saviano was 11 years old.
He used us for his own sexual gratification. We were coerced into...
Saviano came forward with his story. He was told by bishops in the Diocese of Worcester, Massachusetts, that they had never heard of problems with Father Holly. Saviano pressed forward and filed a lawsuit. During the process of discovery, he obtained 25 years of documents which showed acknowledgement of Holly's sexual misconduct by a group of bishops in the United States. They opted counseling and reassignment for Holly instead of criminal charges. When Holly was finally convicted a few years ago, he'd been accused of molesting more than 100 victims.
It was stunning to see these letters and to see these signatures and know that the problem with Father Holly was not just one crazy priest, but it was the problem of the hierarchy of the church and the way they dealt with them.
Support their claims. Over the years, charges of sexual abuse have resulted in indictments, convictions, or lawsuits against at least 16 priests from this relatively small diocese. The resistance Gagny says he's meeting, according to Phil Saviano of the Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests, is just part of a continuing pattern.
Historically, the response in the Worcester Diocese is not to remove the priest, but to reassign him, get the priest set up in another community, and enable him to continue this sort of behavior.
Saviano is himself a victim of another Worcester priest, Father David Holly, currently serving a 275-year prison term for aggravated sodomy in New Mexico.
I was not the altar boy, but I was the newspaper boy. I lived just up the street from the church.
Saviano says he was one of Holly's first victims, the abuse taking place at St. Denis Church in the Worcester County town of Douglas. In the process of preparing a lawsuit against the church, a suit he has since settled, Saviano came across numerous letters from the Bishop of Worcester to his contemporaries in other states asking for a parish job for Holly. In 1971, the Bishop of Worcester wrote to the Bishop of Wilmington, Delaware, "For this man's own peace of mind and the good souls," the bishop wrote, "we have determined that he should seek an opportunity to work elsewhere." Holly was transferred to Texas and to New Mexico, where he allegedly left a trail of victims.
The outrage of a Massachusetts family who said they were promised that a suspended priest accused of molesting a child would never work anywhere else. That promise was broken.
They were just trying to farm him out of this area and hoping he would just go away.
Fast forward to yesterday, a Texas bishop admits he hired Texar in the late 80s, denies he knew Texar's past, and defends himself with a letter from the Worcester Diocese that recommended the suspended priest.
Well, it's another example of the church going way out of its way to protect the child molesters.
Abuse victim Phil Saviano says he knows how it goes. He runs the local branch of a victim support group.
The bishops, instead of transferring these guys out of state, should have transferred them right out of the priesthood.
Well, we told you earlier that a secret Vatican document, some 41 years old, has been revealed, and that it instructed members of the church from the highest level down to consider allegations of sexual abuse by priests as the strictest secret.
Well, I think it lays out the plan that the Vatican had. It's almost as if it's a textbook that all the bishops were taking their lessons from. Because as we've learned in the last 18 months, in diocese after diocese, not only across the United States, but in many other parts of the world, bishops had a plan whereby victims were silenced, pedophile priests were protected, and none of this was ever reported to civil authorities or revealed to the general public.
But Phil, what I don't understand, if this was disseminated to bishops throughout the United States, how come it's remained secret this long?
It doesn't surprise me at all. There's a lot of secrecy within the Vatican. For example, if you look at this document, it's filled with terms like secret archives and perpetual silence and destroying evidence, secret of the Holy Office. I'm just tremendously relieved that finally the document is surfaced and it's being given the attention that it warrants. It talks very clearly about investigating crimes against children, swearing all sides to secrecy. There's one part of this document that talks about the victim being forced to put his hands on the Bible and swear that he would keep this a secret under the threat of excommunication. Well, I had heard rumors of this document for several years, and I had often wondered how it was that each bishop in each diocese was pretty much operating the same way in terms of moving priests from parish to parish and you know, having victims sign confidentiality agreements. The effort was always on secrecy and protecting the priest. And I thought it was very curious that each bishop was acting the same way. And now this sort of answers that, because it shows that perhaps there was a document or a plan that everybody was working from.
Well, it's a fascinating document. It's really still a developing story, one we're going to be following closely.
I'd like to say that if your viewers want to see the document, they can log on to our website.
And I'd like each of you to tell me a little bit about what happened to you, a little bit of your story. And Bernie, why don't you start?
Yes, I was abused as a kid, 11, 12 years old, 1968, 69, in St. James Parish in Salem, Mass. Father Birmingham was the priest. I was an altar boy. I was abused in the sacristy. I was abused in his car when he came out into my neighborhood. And I was abused in the guidance room, which was the cult room between the two classrooms while class was in session. Multiple classmates also were abused at the same time in same settings.
And Olin, I know that you were abused by the same priest. Is your story similar to Bernie?
By the same priest. Actually, Bernie's parents had a courageous story who had gone to the chancery to tell officials that he had been abused and that Joseph Birmingham was abusing boys within the parish. And they assured him that they would get him help, and they moved him away. And they moved him to my parish, where I got to know him. Joseph Birmingham became a terrible reminder of all that goes wrong when the official people in a position of protecting children really didn't do what they were supposed to do. And he began his reign of pedophilia upon myself and my whole parish. and subsequently, years later, moved to another parish where he continued the same sort of behavior.
Hello, I'm Hannah Gartner. Welcome to the Fifth Estate. Charles Sylvester committed his life to serving God on earth as a Catholic priest. He was also a pedophile priest, one of the worst in Canadian history. He died recently at 84, leaving behind a trail of shattered lives. For almost 40 years, Father Sylvester sexually molested girls between the ages of 7 and 15. And for decades, he got away with it because the church kept silent, protecting its priest and its own public image. By covering up the crimes, the church allowed Father Sylvester to continue to preach good while committing evil. Father Sylvester has molested hundreds of little girls. Every time the diocese moved him to another church, he was given access to a whole new group of young victims. Crown Attorney Paul Bailey. You assume that one of the safest places anywhere would be the church.
Well, it's even worse than that, Hannah, because these little girls, some of them were in their classroom where they're required by law to be. So the teachers or the parents send them to the classroom. The priest shows up and says, you, and you, come with me. And out they go, either ostensibly to be interviewed to see if they're ready for confirmation or to fold bulletins, and then they're sexually molested. So where is a safe spot for them? If a child can't be safe in their own classroom, where is a safe spot for a child?
The truth was becoming painfully clear. Sylvester could have been stopped 40 years ago. Remember Irene Williams? Police interviewed her in 1962. Retired Sarnia detective Donald MacDonald recalls how Father Sylvester got away.
I was in the cruiser and I got a radio message to proceed to the Catholic Church in Bluewater regarding Father Sylvester and molesting young girls. And I met the priest in charge there. I don't remember his name. And he says, well, he's gone back to Quebec. And you won't get him back here. Well, I guess he was right, because we didn't get him back.
John Cody, the bishop at the time, had Sylvester removed before police could question him.
Were you made aware by other church officials about Sarnia police making inquiries?
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm. Who made you aware of that?
The bishop.
Sylvester continued molesting with impunity for 23 more years. When Chatham police began investigating in 2003, they knew there must be a lot more victims out there who had been keeping their secret for decades. Looking for leads, police ordered up Sylvester's personnel file, but the church was not cooperative, according to lead investigator George Flickward.
We wanted to know if there was any other women or children that had disclosed and that might be in his personnel file. We eventually received part of a file.
You say eventually in quotation marks, I'm hearing in your voice?
Yeah, we didn't feel that we had his whole personnel records.
And that file had to be extracted from them?
Yes.
And what they finally ended up with was very thin, according to the Crown Attorney.
We were suspicious right from the beginning that this cannot be the complete file.
So many of these little girls went to parents, they went to teachers, they went to the police, they even went to the bishop. So the church knew.
The church, we did know, yes.
Wouldn't be a victim, and neither would many other women, and that angers me so much because I did not have to be victimized.
Father Charles Sylvester is not just one bad apple. Since the mid-70s, there have been 11 other convicted pedophile priests from the London diocese, and the church did not call police on any of them. Their sex crimes included everything from gross indecency, indecent assault, to attempted buggery. There's also a warrant out for the arrest of one priest who left the London diocese in '91. He's now in Malta, facing charges of defilement and rape. But change comes slowly to the world's most powerful religious institution, and there is a long history of sexual abuse to overcome, according to Catholic scholar Tom Doyle.
They've been part of a pattern, part of the actual fabric of the life of the Catholic Church for centuries, where clergy, priests, bishops, cardinals have sexually abused children, minors, vulnerable adults. That's nothing new.
Doyle is also a priest who works with the victims of pedophile priests, testifying at hundreds of trials. You have been a priest for over 20 years. How do you characterize your church's handling of clergy who sexually abuse?
How do I characterize it? It's been a debacle. They have mishandled it on about every possible level.
A German priest at the center of a sexual abuse scandal that's embroiled Pope Benedict has been suspended after breaching a ban on working with children. Father Hullerman was first accused of sexually abusing young boys in 1980, but church officials, including the future pope, allowed him to stay in the church for 30 years, even after a 1986 conviction of sexually abusing children. In recent weeks, more than 100 reports have emerged of abuse at Catholic institutions in Germany, including one linked to the prestigious Regensburg choir, once run by the Pope's brother. Meanwhile, pressure is mounting for the head of the Catholic Church in Ireland to resign over revelations that he did not report complaints against a pedophile priest to police 35 years ago. At a meeting in 1975, Cardinal Sean Brady spoke with children abused by a priest named Brendan Smith. Instead of reporting the abuse to the police, Brady asked the children to take a vow of silence. The founder of the child abuse support group 1 in 4, Colm O'Gorman, said the priest continued to rape and abuse children.
Remember, they carried out the investigation. They interviewed the child victims of this priestly rapist. Sean Brady determined in his own mind that these children were telling the truth, and he then simply passed the information up the line and did nothing. And for another 18 years, as Sean Brady rose through the ranks in the Catholic Church hierarchy, Brendan Smith continued to rape and abuse children.
The Vatican is defending the Pope against new allegations of abuse involving children at a deaf school in the US. Pope Benedict XVI is being accused of not acting when a priest in Milwaukee was accused of molesting nearly 200 deaf children between 1950 and 1974. Families have travelled to Rome for an explanation. The church was reportedly told about Reverend Lawrence Murphy's behaviour by the Archbishop of Wisconsin.
It went all the way up and they knew about this and they allowed these priests to be moved.
Pope Benedict has been accused of failing to act against an American priest in the 1990s, believed to have molested over 200 deaf children. Evidence has emerged that the pontiff was alerted to the case at the time by an archbishop, but didn't respond.
Father Lawrence Murphy preyed upon the most vulnerable children quite literally without voices. And today, one of them, Arthur Budzinski, speaking through his daughter, said this about Pope Benedict.
He should be removed as the Pope, for protecting child molesters. That's not a man that should be leading a church.
Father Murphy allegedly abused upwards of 200 boys while working at the St. John's School for the Deaf in Milwaukee in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Arthur Budzinski says he was abused during confession and in his bed at night.
They would all sleep in one huge dorm room, and he would see Father Murphy walking throughout the beds and molesting children.
Father Murphy was removed from the school in 1974, but it wasn't until 1996 that the Archbishop of Milwaukee, facing a potential lawsuit, alerted the Vatican, sending a letter to the man who ran the office that oversaw abuse cases, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, now Pope Benedict.
Victims of abuse at a school for the deaf in Milwaukee, where as many as 200 children were molested by Father Lawrence Murphy over 2 decades, say the Pope failed to heed his own advice.
Well, the Pope knew about this. He was the one who handled the sex abuse cases. So I think he should be accountable because he did nothing.
My name is Joey Piscatelli, and I'm the Northern California Director for SNAP, the Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests. The protest is a response to the Pope's statements yesterday where he said that the allegations by the 200 deaf kids who were sexually abused. He said that they were petty and petty opinions. And people have a hard time accepting the fact that the supposed holiest man on earth has conducted himself in a criminal manner. I was sexually abused by a priest in the 70s, and I came forward at the time and they told me to shut up or they're going to kick me out of school. In 2003, I filed a suit against the Catholic Church and the Salesian Society. The suit dragged on for 5 years in court. They kept the priest who molested me in ministry with children the whole time, even while the trial was going on, and the priest was found guilty. I don't recommend seeking spirituality in an atmosphere of rulers who have notoriously raped children for hundreds of years, gotten away with it, and now literally are calling it petty.
Away tonight, I'm Scott Pelley. We begin tonight with a surprising development in the sex abuse scandal in the Roman Catholic Church. For decades, priests in this country have abused children in parish after parish while their superiors covered it all up. Now, it turns out the orders for this cover-up were written in Rome at the highest levels of the Vatican. Correspondent Vince Gonzalez has uncovered a church document kept secret 40 years until now.
The confidential Vatican document obtained by CBS News lays out a church policy that calls for absolute secrecy when it comes to sexual abuse by priests. Anyone who speaks out could be thrown out of the church. The policy was written in 1962 by Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani, seen here crowning Pope Paul VI. The document, once stored in the secret archives of the Vatican, focuses on crimes initiated as part of the confessional relationship, and what it calls the worst crime, sexual assault committed by a priest or attempted by him with youths of either sex or with brute animals. Bishops are instructed to pursue these cases in the most secretive way, restrained by a perpetual silence, and everyone, including the alleged victim, is to observe the strictest secret, which is commonly regarded as a secret of the Holy Office, under the penalty of excommunication.
This document is significant because it's a blueprint for deception.
Larry Dravon says this proves what he has alleged on behalf of victims in priest abuse lawsuits, that the church engaged in a crime, racketeering.
It's an instruction manual on how to deceive and how to protect pedophiles and how to avoid the truth coming out.
Sipe, a former priest who has written about sex abuse and secrecy in the church, says the document sends a chilling message.
This is the code for how you must deal with sex by priests. You keep it secret at all costs. And that's what's happened. That's what's happened in every diocese in this country.
According to church records, the document was a bedrock of Catholic sex abuse policy until America's bishops met last summer and drafted new policies to address the crisis in the church.
Good evening. The Vatican issued yet another statement today trying to play down the fact that the Catholic Church appears to have turned a blind eye to widespread child abuse by its priests. The Church is under a cloud in the United States, in Austria, in Germany, in the Netherlands, and in Ireland. The Pope's said to be preparing a pastoral letter to apologise to Irish Catholics for the fact that the Church there covered up for child molesting priests for 30 years. The hierarchy and the Irish government claim to have done all they can to root out abusing priests and bring them to justice. As you're about to see in Alenka Frenkel's report, that's not how it seems in at least one case.
For years, this man thought his secret was safe.
Paul came to me and told me that Carney had raped him.
Bill Carney is a serial sexual abuser of children, male and female.
It cites complaints or suspicions
in respect of 32 named individuals. There is evidence that he abused many more children.
The Murphy report into the cover-up of clerical sex abuse in Dublin said the case of Father Bill Carney was one of the worst they'd investigated. The church handling of the many allegations against him was
nothing short of catastrophic. it displayed no obvious concern for the welfare of children.
In 1983, Carney pleaded guilty to 2 counts of indecent assault, but the case was hushed up. He stayed a priest and continued to have access to children. Field Parish, Dublin. Paul Dwyer, age 13, asked his mother if he could go with another boy to watch videos and sleep over at Father Carney's parish house. But in the night, he was back home, knocking to be let in.
He pushed me out the way at the hall door, ran up the stairs, and I said, "Thought you were doing a sleepover." He said, "Oh, I didn't want to stay." And that's when he had been raped. But I didn't know.
We now know from the Murphy report that other complaints against Carney were sent by the police to the bishop, not to the Director of Public Prosecutions. Bishop James Kavanagh, says the report, had a soft spot for Carney and did his best to protect the priest from the law and the church from scandal. Kavanagh is now dead. Even after Carney's convictions in 1983, he continued to be a priest with access to children. But by 1992, even the church had had enough. He was found guilty of child sexual abuse under canon law. The church noted the compulsive and deluded nature of his condition.
His denial of wrongdoing, his total absence of remorse, the enduring and habitual nature of his offences.
His punishment in this church court? To be defrocked. But when he refused to leave the premises, they secretly paid him 30,000 Irish pounds to go away.
Good evening. Today, the Pope was accused of helping to cover up the appalling child abuse of up to 200 deaf children in Wisconsin, while working in his previous post as Cardinal in the Vatican. The future Pope was told about the abuse allegations in the 1990s, according to church files released today as part of a US lawsuit. No action was taken against the abuser, Father Murphy, who had written to the future pontiff pleading for leniency. The Vatican has denied a cover-up, but Pope Benedict XVI is now under more pressure than ever before. Here's Peter Marshall.
Close to home and far away, the Catholic Church proudly boasts of its universality. This is a scandal that now hits it everywhere. And for the first time, the Pope himself stands accused of a cover-up.
The Pope in his office had this case. He had bishops in Wisconsin virtually begging him in his office to take this man out of the priesthood. And they couldn't do it. I mean, if you have a priest thousands of miles away molesting children, and that bishop says, we've got to get him out of ministry because he is so dangerous, and the Vatican says, no, we're not going to do that. For whatever reason, there's something terribly wrong with an institution like that.
The case is that of a priest who worked at a school for deaf children in Milwaukee from the 1950s until 1974. He raped and assaulted over 200 boys. His victims are still asking why the then Cardinal Ratzinger, who's now Pope Benedict, turned away. One of the victims was Arthur Buzinski. He spent 30 years trying to raise the alarm. His daughter blames Ratzinger.
He was the one who handled the sex abuse cases. So I think he should be accountable because he did nothing.
The priest, Father Lawrence Murphy, was quietly moved from the school but continued working freely with children in Wisconsin until his death 24 years later. What's so damaging about this case for the Pope is the paper trail, letters in the 1990s from Milwaukee's then Archbishop, Rembert Weekland, to Cardinal Ratzinger, who ran the Vatican office adjudicating whether priests should be defrocked. On July the 17th, 1996, the Archbishop tells the Cardinal,
I am writing to inform you of two situations in which two priests of this archdiocese have been accused of solicitation of a penitent so as to commit a sin against the sixth commandment of the Decalogue.
It seems the Cardinal ignored the letter, for 8 months later, on March the 10th, 1997, Archbishop Weekland wrote to a second Vatican official saying,
I wrote to His Eminence Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger. My hope was that His Eminence would grant special norms for a penal process in this case. So far, however, I have received no response.
At this point, Cardinal Bertoni, on Pope Benedict's right here, today he's the Vatican Secretary of State, intervened, initiating a secret canonical trial of Father Murphy. But in January 1998, this was suddenly stopped when Murphy himself wrote to Cardinal Ratzinger.
I'm 72 years of age, Your Eminence, and am in poor health. I simply want to live out the time that I have left in the dignity of my priesthood. I ask your kind assistance in this matter.
What I think is most extraordinary about this Milwaukee case is the way in which the Vatican simply ignored the wishes of an archbishop. Archbishop Rembert Weakland, a man of great esteem, held in great esteem in many parts of the church. It was sort of arrogance on their part, it seems to me, that not to take him seriously when he told them that a priest had to be removed from the priesthood, and they just ignored it. And he was the man, in a sense, Cardinal Ratzinger, as he was then, was the man responsible for this.
This is becoming a papal Watergate, with Pope Benedict in the role of President Nixon. It's not the crime, the sex abuse practiced by some priests, it's the cover-up. And every week, it seems, that gets closer to the man the Church holds is God's representative on earth. Bad enough, the perpetrators using the authority of the Church to commit their crimes, but just as shocking, the allegation the man who's now Pope deployed pontifical secrecy to bury the truth. Only last week, the Pope issued a letter to Irish Catholics in which he reprimanded Ireland's bishops for failing to show leadership over sex abuse cases. Now it's his ultimate leadership in question.
In a sense, if popes can have egg on their faces, I would have thought that he had egg on his face. I mean, it has come back and to haunt him, exactly what he accused the Irish of. He could almost now be accused of the same thing.
Failing in his duty.
Failing in his duty.
Today in Rome, a group from Milwaukee tried to take their questions for the Pope direct to the Vatican. They were briefly detained by the police.
To say, as they have been, that Cardinal Ratzinger courageously went after sex offender priests when he was running the congregation, which was his responsibility to do that, you can see from this case, that is absolutely not true. And he needs to explain to these victims.
There's a medieval aphorism which runs, "The Pope is judged by no one." It may be that this Pope finds that for millions of Catholics, that no longer applies.
Joel Castex, survivor of sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. The #1 goal of every bishop, and a part of the vows that they take when they become bishop, is to protect the church from scandal. And protecting the church from scandal means that documents, witnesses, and victims are kept quiet and shuffled away.
Castex is a regional director for SNAP, a survivors network for people who've been abused by priests. She's still angry that her abuser has never been brought to justice.
He was protected by the exact same system that protects all of these priests, which includes orders directly from the Vatican, which require that every diocese have secret personnel files that no one gets a hold of.
Those files are kept on every priest ever accused of sex abuse against a child. They're kept confidential, not to protect the victim, to protect the priest. Yeah.
Greatest hypocrisy in the church today is that child protection is not the most important thing. Patrick J. Wall, senior consultant, law firm of Manley and Stewart.
Wall is a former priest who now works for a law firm that prosecutes sex abuse cases involving the church. His firm's been swamped since the bombshell discovery of a secret Vatican document in 2003. It's called the crime of enticement, which they discreetly write in Latin.
Crimen Solicitationis is an interesting document published in 1962 and is an order to all archbishops, bishops, cardinals, and heads of religious orders on how to exactly deal with an accusation of childhood sexual abuse by a cleric.
So, how did this confidential document come to light? Did Jesus return and expose the Vatican's little secret?
There was a priest on the west coast here of California who was being accused of sexual abuse of a minor. And in a way to try to get back at the church, he got one of his buddies who was in the congregation in Rome to give him a copy of the document. And then he gave it to a lawyer, and from there it took off.
Why all the excitement? Because the document contains actual proof of an organized Vatican cover-up. Specifically, this little McNugget. Anyone involved in a sex abuse investigation, the accuser and the accused, are to be restrained by a perpetual silence in all matters and with all persons under the penalty of excommunication. You're probably wondering, gee, If the Pope did that, why isn't he under some sort of investigation? The answer? In 2005, the Pope was granted immunity from liability in any sex abuse cover-ups in the U.S. by President George W. Bush.
We have is that the church puts itself forward as the perfect society, as the bella figura, as everything perfect that exists in the world because it's inspired by God and the Holy Spirit. But we know it's a business. And in order to keep that cash flow going, you have to keep that perfect ideal up there in order for people to contribute to it.
Well, Vatican suffers another major blow as the Pope's top advisor on the pedophilia scandal, Archbishop Angelo Bainesco, has one of his priests arrested on pedophilia and drug charges. 51-year-old Father Ricardo Sepia was arrested on May 13th. Investigators say that in taped mobile phone conversations, Sepia asked a Moroccan drug dealer to arrange sexual encounters with young and vulnerable.
I'm sorry to have to begin by disagreeing with His Grace. If you're going to be a serious grown-up person and appear to defend the Catholic Church in public in front of an educated and literate audience, you simply have to start by making a great number of heartfelt apologies and requests for contrition and forgiveness. Now you might ask, you're fully entitled to ask, brothers and sisters, who am I to say that? Well, in the Jubilee Millennium Year of 2000, the Vatican spokesman, Bishop Piero Marini, said, explaining a whole sermon of apology given by His Holiness the Pope, given the number of sins we've committed in the course of 20 centuries, reference to them must necessarily be rather summary. Well, I think Bishop Marini had that just about right. I'll have to be summary too. His Holiness on that occasion, it was March the 12th, 2000, if you wish to look it up, begged forgiveness for, among some other things, the Crusades, the Inquisition, the persecution of the Jewish people, injustice towards women, that's half the human race right there, and the forced conversion of indigenous peoples, especially in South America, the African slave trade, the admission that Galileo was right, and for silence during Hitler's final solution, or Shoah. And it doesn't end there. There are smaller but significant, equally significant, avowals of a very bad conscience. These have included regret for the rape and the torture of orphans and other children in church-run schools in almost every country on earth, from Ireland to Australia.
We begin tonight with renewed controversy facing the Catholic Church. No pope has resigned his position since the 15th century. But if some critics had their way, that's exactly what Pope Benedict would do. This Holy Week has seen him defending the Vatican and himself against allegations that he knew about and failed to act on sexual abuse by priests years ago. But in one major scandal, his role may have been far more complicated than that, as our chief investigative correspondent Brian Ross reports. Brian?
Cynthia, with growing questions about the role of Pope Benedict and the Catholic Church sex scandal, there is new attention to his handling, as Cardinal Ratzinger, of probably the most egregious, notorious case of them all, involving a priest with powerful connections inside the Vatican, who was also a drug addict and a pedophile. For years, despite repeated allegations that Father Marcial Maciel had sexually abused young men, Pope John Paul II continued to call him an important leader of Catholic youth.
Father Maciel was a revered figure in the Vatican. He also had the advantage of being the greatest fundraiser of the modern church.
Father Maciel was the founder of a little-known but well-financed Catholic order called the Legionaries of Christ.
I think Father Maciel used money the way some politicians do in spreading it liberally to buy support, both for himself and his religious order.
Investigative journalist Jason Berry first broke the story of Father Maciel in 1997 and has tracked what he says is a decades-long trail of cash and gifts to top Vatican officials from Maciel.
I think in hindsight, it's clear that he was trying to protect himself, and so he lavished gifts, generous, expensive gifts, on many members of the Roman Curia. And on top of that, he made a point of cultivating friendships with these men.
And as a result, when the Vatican received allegations against Maciel, it touched off what appears to have been a high-level power struggle between the Vatican Secretary of State and then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, now Pope Benedict. Father Maciel's Legionaries of Christ now operates in the United States and 23 other countries, with its well-manicured headquarters located in Rome, just a few miles from the Vatican. It was here, at this seminary and others, that Father Maciel was alleged to have molested some of the young men under his control as seminarians, going back to the 1950s.
He pushed my hand into his penis, and I didn't know anything about masturbation. And he says, you don't know how to do it, let me show you.
Juan Vaca, a former priest now in his 70s and living in New York as a college professor, says he was one of some 30 boys abused by Father Maciel.
I was the one who called them from their bedrooms to go to see Maciel.
Vaca says Father Maciel rewarded him with special privileges, such as this private meeting with Pope Pius XII, and always assured him he was doing nothing wrong.
But, Father, I think I committed a sin. Don't worry, I absolve you from your sin in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
It was in 1998 that Vaca and other former members of the Legion filed a formal legal case with the Vatican, asking for an investigation of Maciel. But for years, nothing happened.
Absolutely nothing. Not a word.
The man in charge of investigating was the then Cardinal Ratzinger.
I wanted to ask you a question about Father Maciel.
Can you talk about it? I'm not so informed.
He became upset when I tried to ask him about the Maciel case in 2002 and slapped my hand.
There's a question whether you covered up...
No, a moment.
No, there's a question whether you...
Come to me when the moment is given, not yet.
Well, we try to ask you questions.
Behind Cardinal Ratzinger's reaction, says journalist Jason Berry, was the effort of the Vatican Secretary of State to protect Maciel.
And Ratzinger basically got the message, do not go after this man.
Berry says both Pope John Paul II and the Vatican Secretary of State, Cardinal Angelo Sodano, emerged as Father Maciel's protectors.
It's strikingly clear that John Paul II did not want to investigate Maciel, and Sodano was clearly the man who enforced that message to Ratzinger.
Pope John Paul II's close relationship with Maciel and the Legionaries of Christ was no secret. He appeared in public frequently with Maciel, before and after the allegations of sexual abuse became public, including this scene in Berry's documentary Vows of Silence.
Así como al padre Marcial Maciel.
Berry says Cardinal Ratzinger became increasingly convinced the Maciel case was turning into a huge liability for the Vatican.
He should have excommunicated Maciel, and he should have immediately reined in the Legion of Christ.
Maciel died in 2008, and since then more of the details of his astounding deception and sordid double life have become known. He fathered a daughter with one of his mistresses in Mexico. Two men have gone public on a Mexican radio station to claim they are the sons of Father Maciel, one claiming he was actually sexually abused by his father. The priest at the Legionaries of Christ, who once followed and defended Maciel so blindly, now acknowledge they were wrong.
It was like you found out that your dad had been, sleeping around with women the whole time you were growing up. That's what it felt like. You felt completely betrayed and shocked.
In 1989, Bishop Daniel Ryan drove about 45 minutes north of his diocese office in Springfield, Illinois, to the town of Lincoln. He came here to Lincoln to visit one of his priests, a priest who was living here, in a prison.
In 1985, Father Alvin Campbell pleaded guilty to multiple charges of sexual assault on boys as young as 11 years old. He was sentenced to 14 years in prison. Matt McCormick was one of the children Campbell abused.
I don't come by the school, and I don't come by the church.
Starting in 7th grade, Campbell molested McCormick in the church's school, the rectory, and even here.
Is this the confessional you were in?
This is a confessional. And he would sit there.
Campbell was sent to prison, but he was still a priest. That's why Bishop Ryan had come to visit him, to try to convince him to voluntarily leave the priesthood. Campbell refused. So Ryan turned to Rome for help. He sent copies of Campbell's indictments, spelling out in graphic detail what Campbell had done to his victims, and asked Joseph Ratzinger to defrock Campbell. Ratzinger's answer? No. The petition in question cannot be admitted, inasmuch as it lacks the request of Father Campbell himself, which is called for by the current norms.
Incredibly, what Cardinal Ratzinger was saying was that he could not agree to defrock a priest, even a convicted child molester, without that priest's permission.
We showed the letter to Matt McCormick. It was the first time he'd seen it.
I'm sorry, I have to read this again.
What's the first thing you would say to Pope Benedict if you were face to face with him?
What would I say to him? I'd say that what you've done is created an environment for pedophiles and molesters of children to exist. And the violation of these children falls on your shoulders.
And finally, an acknowledgement that the crisis did not come from enemies of the church on the outside, but was, quote, born from the sin within the church.
And that is, what about the bishops? The bishops who covered up priestly abuse and moved those priests from parish to parish.
We've been crying and crying and crying to do something about the bishops who have covered up, who have lied about this, who have wasted hundreds of millions of dollars of the faithful's money to stonewall it, through the courts. They've done nothing about these bishops.
Bishops like Cardinal Bernard Law of Boston, who covered up the crimes of priests who assaulted dozens of children. He eventually was forced to resign, only to end up as a cardinal in Rome.
He has this grand title, great apartment, and real power, real authority in the Vatican, and yet he is one of the most notorious bishops from this whole era of scandal.
Gibson believes the Pope will never publicly rebuke the bishops.
He doesn't want to open up that can of worms because he doesn't want to cause difficulties for his brother bishops. The bishops of the church are his colleagues. That is his circle.
And there is more unfinished business. Even now, it's hard to believe, but there are priests accused of abuse hiding in plain sight in the church.
Hullermann, the German pedophile priest overseen by Cardinal Ratzinger in Munich, 14 years after his conviction, he was still a priest in the town of Bad Tolz in Germany, until the church finally suspended him last spring. To date, Pope Benedict has never personally addressed his role in the Hullermann case, or why Hullermann remained a priest for so long.